Arnhem 80, the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden and the Battle of Arnhem. We'd been planning this trip for months, yet still weren't quite prepared for the intensity of the journey out. Leaving school at 3 p.m, dashing home for a suit that I forgot to pack, racing down to Wiltshire to meet Tom and Dima, cross-decking Kit into Tom's car, and then buckling up for the 4-hour drive to Dover. The ferry was bumped back an hour to midnight, which pushed our arrival time in Oosterbeek back to 06:30. And this led to a truly phenomenal effort by Tom, who drove the whole way, Jeep in tow, from Wiltshire to the Netherlands. One point from that journey stands out in my memory. A conversation with P&O at Dover as we checked in. The chap processing us asked if the vehicle on our trailer was second-hand, to which Tom had to laugh and replied that it was 80 years old and probably 5th or 6th or 7th hand. Soberingly, we then realised that the last time this Jeep had crossed the Channel was probably for Operation Varsity in March 1945, and that time by glider, not ferry. It was an odd experience to be sailing across the calm Channel under the bright moonlight, knowing that D-Day, 80 years and 3 months before, was an entirely different crossing altogether, and that the airborne route for Operation Market Garden was arguably worse again. Arriving at dawn, we pulled into the grounds of Jan Pieterheer, part of the Plurin Educational Trust. The tents of the airborne battle wheels covered the field, and we wandered and waited and yawned a lot as the camp slowly came to life. With a space eventually identified for us, we erected the Arctic Bell tent and established ourselves for our 4 days ahead. And, well, had a little power nap too. The rest of this video will follow our journey in the events of the battle that we traced, although, for the sake of continuity, I've moved 1 or 2 activities around, as our timetable didn't quite follow the chronological events of the battle. Following their landing on the 17th of September 1944, the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron, under the overall command of Major Freddy Goff, had been ordered to race ahead to the Rhine Bridge before the Germans had the opportunity to blow it up. This was General Urquhart's intended coup de main, and would have been swiftly supported by the arrival of 2 Para in Arnhem soon afterwards. Goff and his troops had not trained for such an assignment, but Brigadier Lathbury chose to deploy the Recce Squadron, thinking that the 10 kilometres to the bridge would be covered in only half an hour in their jeeps. The paratroopers had arrived by parachute onto Drop Zone X, whilst their vehicles came in by glider onto Drop Zone Z. This left Lieutenant Bucknell with C Troop, impatiently awaiting the arrival of their jeeps, before they then took off along a track towards Wolfhazer, in the very first jeeps that arrived. Trooper Arthur Barlow recalled it took another 5 minutes before the other jeeps showed up, and they then followed the first, with the other jeeps following them. The jeeps had lined up correctly and followed at the correct distances, each one just close enough to his predecessor to receive his hand signals, except that Lieutenant Bucknell's jeep already had a 5-minute lead and was out of sight. Proceeding along Route Leopard, the column sped past the railway crossing at Wolfhazer. They took a small lane to the north of the railway embankment, and it was here that they collided with a German blocking line hastily formed by Major Kraft's SS Training Battalion. Coming under heavy fire, Lieutenant Bucknell's jeep was hit and began to burn, while the crews of the jeeps behind rapidly spread out into defensive positions. Sadly, Lieutenant Bucknell and his crew were killed at the ambush site, and Sergeant Tom McGregor was killed as he went forward to investigate. The rest of the column came under sporadic mortar fire, but managed to fight off some armoured cars with the Polston guns which they carried. These were 20mm anti-aircraft guns, repurposed, rather effectively, against the German armour. Attempts to outflank the enemy force were dashed, and hopes of reaching Arnhem Bridge quickly faded. Trooper Barlow recorded, "On the way to Wolfhazer, we had not encountered any other soldiers. Citizens waved to us from behind the windows or from their gardens. We didn't stop to speak to anyone. We weren't concerned about any possible encounters with Germans. We were told we would encounter little resistance. We hoped that the whole way to the bridge would remain this quiet. We crossed the railway line at Wolfhazer and turned right onto a dirt track leading along the railway. At that moment, two things happened almost simultaneously. In front of us, we heard heavy shooting, and at the same time, we were fired on from the right. Reg Hasler was at the wheel and stopped immediately after a volley of machine gun fire splashed across the radiator. Jimmy Pierce, Tom McGregor, and I ducked to the side of the road. Dickie Minns, Hasler, and Taffy Thomas lay to the left of the Jeep and partially underneath it. The machine gun continued to fire. Trooper Minns had the least coverage. His hip was shattered, and he suffered 2 other gunshot wounds. He lay on the road, bleeding profusely and calling for help. Thomas was hit in the foot, and Hasler was hit in both legs. He pushed himself up onto his hands to look around, and was immediately hit in the face and chest by the machine gun. He fell flat on his face and died without kicking. After exchanging shots for about half an hour, the British surrendered and were taken as prisoners of war. After less than a kilometre, the recce squadron race to the bridge had already ended, with 7 men killed and 4 men captured. Ironically, though, Major Gough and 2 jeeps from the HQ squadron did make it through to the bridge later that day and did meet up with 2 para. The rest of the recce squadron went on to make valuable contributions to the battles, its jeeps providing useful towing for anti-tank guns and for evacuating the wounded. As part of our visit, Tom, Deemer and I attended the opening ceremony of the Airborne Battle Wheels event. This over, we then stopped to explore the nearby Hackett's Hollow, where, much later in the battle, on the 20th of September, 250 members of 156 and 10 Battalion Parachute Regiment were pinned down by German machine guns, tanks and flamethrowers for 8 hours. 156 Battalion, as part of the 4th Parachute Brigade, under the command of General Shan Hackett, had landed on Drop Zone Y at Ginkle Heath on the 18th of September. The battalion consisted of 603 men, broken down into a headquarters company, support company, and 3 rifle companies, each consisting of a company headquarters and 3 platoons of 35 men each, bringing the strength of each company to around 125 men. The support company had with it 4 6-pounder anti-tank guns from the 1st Anti-Tank Battery Royal Artillery, as well as mortars and machine guns. The drop zone was under enemy fire as they dropped, with a battle ongoing between the 7th King's Own Scottish Borderers and Wacht Battalion Enfow Dry, made up of Dutch Waffen SS. By coincidence, the route the 156 Battalion took towards Arnhem led them past the culvert that had witnessed the end of the coup de main by the recce squadron only a day before. There's no way to know if the battalion then passed through this same tunnel or if they found a different crossing point over the railway, but records do show that when C Company was later ambushed, the entire battalion was withdrawn to the tunnel under the railway at Wolfhazer, this time almost certainly the same as the recce squadron culvert. At this point, we took a little detour from the events of that day in 1944. You see, an urban myth had once emerged, suggesting that jeeps from the 4th Parachute Regiment had driven through the culvert and even dragged artillery pieces behind them in a desperate bid for safety. Given that we were this close to it, it seemed silly not to see if this myth could be true. On the 19th of September, 156 Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Vaux, set out to occupy 3 strategic heights. The first overlooked the Johannahoeve, the second was in woods near the Lichtenbeek estate, and finally at a height known as Die Koepel, 5 kilometres from Arnhem. 10 parachute battalion advanced along the Amsterdam road, providing cover for them on the left flank. The British advanced, making rapid progress hour after hour, with a pattern of marching for 50 minutes, then stopping for a 10-minute tea break. However, at the Dry Jensweg, they then encountered fierce German resistance. With bayonets on rifles, they charged to break through the German defence line. They managed to overrun the front positions, but the attack was stopped by fire from armoured vehicles. Members of C Company did reach the Lichtenbeek estate and set up a defensive position on the Lichtenbeek hill, but these were quickly surrounded and came under fire from the Germans. An hour later, they were captured. B Company had also been defeated by the German defenders, and Hackett gave the order to withdraw. The battalion could simply not compete with the German tanks and armoured vehicles, and by now had lost about half its strength. Through the Wolfheiser Boss and the Bilderberg Bossen, the remains of 156 Battalion desperately retreated towards the relative safety of Oosterbeek, finally arriving at Hackett's Hollow. 250 men entered a small hollow in the woods, where they huddled and held off attacks by German infantry, tanks and flamethrowers for the next 8 hours. As casualties grew, Brigadier Hackett seized the only initiative available to him and led a bayonet charge of the remaining 150 paras through the German line and into the Oosterbeek perimeter.
We've got the Hercules running over, Globe Masters and a few others. Simulating the airdrops of equipment, supplies, back to the beleaguered troops. Not knowing that the landing zones, drop zones had been overrun. All that stuff was falling into German hands.
We were very lucky in being able to join an extremely enthusiastic and knowledgeable group from Kent, who, on our second day, led us along 2 paras route from the drop zone, past Oosterbeek, along the riverbank of the Nieder Rhine, past the railway bridge and onwards into Arnhem. 2 para had dropped into drop zone X on the 17th of September and were allocated the southernmost of 3 routes from there to Arnhem. 1 para had been allocated the northernmost route to Arnhem, but soon came into contact with the 9th SS Division, northeast of Wolfheiser. 3 para had the centre route, but were seriously hindered by the German defensive line erected between Wolfheiser and Oosterbeek by the German Major Sepp Kraft. Soon after the landings on Sunday 17th September, it became clear that there were more Germans in the Arnhem region than had been expected. A battalion with 500 SS soldiers, coincidentally in the area, blocked the Utrechtsweg and the Amsterdamsweg between Wolfheiser and Oosterbeek. Moreover, in that evening, the first reinforcements of the 9th and 10th SS Armoured Divisions, which were stationed near Arnhem, soon arrived at Arnhem. After dark, the 1st and 3rd Battalions stopped. In the dark, they did not dare to proceed any further in view of the presence of an unknown number of German troops. The 3rd Battalion was located approximately at the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek. The 1st Battalion was stuck 6 kilometres west of Arnhem on the Amsterdamsweg. While those British stopped for the night, the Germans did not sit still, and during the night of September 17 into 18, they formed a first serious line of defence on the western side of Arnhem to prevent the British from reaching John Frost's troops at the Rhine Bridge. 2 para, though, had reached the railway bridge at Oosterbeek the first of 3 bridges that they were tasked to capture at roughly 6 p.m. There were German anti-aircraft guns on both sides of the bridge, but the 6 positions were unmanned when the British approached. A platoon of British was sent across to secure the bridge, but as they did, the Germans blew it up. The capture of their first objective had failed. A little further on at the bridge over the Benedorpsweg, a German armoured vehicle appeared just as the British passed by. It immediately opened fire with its 20mm cannon and machine gun, and several Britons were hit. The armoured vehicle retreated 500 metres to the left and up a slope. Frost sent B Company to investigate, including Claude and Thomas Gronair, twin brothers from Cornwall. As they moved along the road, Claude Gronair was hit. Thomas Gronair then went forward to help his brother, but was also hit and killed by machine gun fire from further along the railway line, running towards Nijmegen. The presence of German troops on that hill, Die Brink, would seriously hinder the advance of the British the next day too. Such was the fighting here that the scarred bridge is now a municipal monument, protected for its historical significance. Having moved beyond Die Brink, the first soldiers of the 2nd Battalion reached the Rhine Bridge around 8 p.m. and just as darkness was falling. To their surprise, the British noticed that the troops of the 1st Airborne Recce Squadron, who should have captured the bridge in their jeeps, were indeed not present. And of course they weren't, having been ambushed at the culvert earlier that day. The British troops quietly took up positions in houses around the bridge, and by 8:45, these now included the headquarters of the 1st Parachute Brigade. By midnight, a company from the 3rd Battalion had found its way through German defences and had joined the troops at the bridge. This provided a force of around 750 British troops present on that first night. The British were established in a defensive line around the north side of the Rhine Bridge, but the bridge itself was still actually in German hands. German vehicles occasionally drove on the bridge itself, but were left alone by the British. A first small attack on the German troops present was on a bunker on the bridge. This attack was repulsed by the Germans, so a second attempt was made around 10 p.m. A flamethrower had been sent to the house closest to the bunker. From here, Sapper Ginger Wilkinson ran up the bridge, fired at the bunker with his flamethrower, but just as he fired, was tapped on the shoulder, causing him to jerk his flamethrower in surprise. The sea of flames went over the bunker. A few wooden sheds just behind them caught fire, and ammunition and gas stored there exploded. In any case, the heat of the fires melted the wiring of the German explosives and prevented the Germans from blowing up the bridge. Back in real time, we were gathered at the 25-pounder displayed adjacent to Arnhem Bridge when a couple cycled up to us and began speaking to Andy as he refueled his Jeep. She asked where we were from and then told us that she was born here in Arnhem. We hadn't picked up on the emphasis given to here, and the lady explained that she was born here, right here, in that house over there at the end of the bridge, on the 6th of September 1944. She was only 11 days old when the British arrived and the battle broke out. She told the most fascinating stories of how the family and neighbours had all sheltered together in their cellar as the fighting broke out around them. The British had moved into their houses above, and it was too dangerous for them to move around. She explained how they lived on carrots as that was all they had available, and how her mother had boiled these down to make a thin soup when she could no longer breastfeed her. The fighting led to shelling, and the cellar was shaken with dust and debris raining down onto them. So, her parents emptied the family fish tank, lined it with bedding, and this became her shelter for the days that followed. After 9 days of fighting and the defeat of the British, the local population were forced by the Germans to leave Arnhem, some 150,000 of them. And that's how she left, in the fish tank, strapped to the family bicycle, as they struck out across country to find shelter with relatives elsewhere in Holland. What a bizarre, almost unreal connection to the past, to this place that we stood, a link to unimaginable experience of what unfolded here, to the ruins that city and people's lives had become in just 9 days. I had to ask, why? When so much damage was caused, why, as so many lives were lost? And in just one example, 95 civilians alone were killed when the RAF bombed suspected German anti-aircraft positions before the parachute drops even began. How could locals be so thankful? The outpouring of remembrance and gratitude was mind-boggling. People were stopping us in the street and thanking us for what we did. School children still lay flowers on the war graves that local people tend throughout the year. And as we were there, almost every house had an airborne flag fluttering from it. I had to ask, and her answer was so obvious it struck me almost physically. The Allies arriving was proof they hadn't been abandoned, that they hadn't been forgotten. Their country had been invaded and their liberties taken from them. You have to remember, she told me, this regime had stopped us from being able to do the right thing. Jews were being persecuted and rounded up, and good people, doing what was right to protect and to help these, were being punished too. How could we live like that? To know that we hadn't been forgotten, that this would not be our experience forever, was beyond words. It remains beyond words. As the battle unfolded, facing the reality that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and with increasingly unreliable communication from his troops, General Urquhart decided to move forwards, taking Brigadier Lathbury and Lieutenants Taylor and Clemerson with him to find out what was slowing the advance to the bridge. In the streets around the Lombok district of Arnhem, the group experienced the full strength of German military presence firsthand, and were forced to take shelter from a German patrol by ducking into a house on Alexanderstraat. Here, a German soldier appeared in the window and was shot by Urquhart. Brigadier Lathbury had been injured and was forced to be left there with civilians, whilst the others escaped into narrow alleyways between the houses. Spotting a couple in an upstairs window beckoning them in, Urquhart, Taylor and Clemerson entered Svarteveg 14, home of the Dirksen family, where they took shelter in the attic and remained trapped with German troops on the streets below them. It was not until the next day, when the South Staffords had been able to recapture the area, that Urquhart and the others could leave their hiding place and, driving a commandeered jeep, return to divisional headquarters and finally take back control. This most unfortunate incident had resulted in Urquhart being detached from the headquarters for some 30 hours in total. It's here that we had another hugely coincidental experience. We were looking around the streets and the alleyways, gaining a real feel for what the fighting must have been like, when a lady approached us and asked us about her grandfather, who it turned out was RSM Lord, a remarkable, renowned military figure. RSM Lord made a number of striking impressions time and time again throughout his military career, but two anecdotes from this period stick out particularly. Firstly, shortly after Urquhart found himself cut off in Arnhem, RSM Lord appointed himself as the general's bodyguard. Urquhart wrote, "As I came out into the road, I found myself accompanied by a massive shape, which turned out to be the 3rd Battalion's RSM, a 6'2" grenadier named Lord. From now on, sir," he informed me, "I'm your bodyguard." Not even generals like to admit they need protection, but I did find his presence rather reassuring. The second incident followed RSM Lord being wounded at Arnhem and sent to a prisoner of war camp. Conditions in the camp were extremely poor, but RSM Lord set about instilling military discipline and boosting morale within the camp, even replacing the German guards with prisoners as the end of the war became evident. On liberating the camp on the 27th of April 1945, Major Ralph Cobbold of the Coldstream Guards described finding a guard with a maroon beret and thought to himself that the 6th Airborne Division must have somehow got there first. On inquiring to the guard commander when they had arrived, he received the reply, "Just after Arnhem, sir." Cobbold goes on. Then a majestic figure appeared, the RSM himself, with gleaming brass, immaculate webbing, razor-edged trouser creases, dazzling boots, and a spectacular salute. On reviewing the camp, the liberators were impressed that despite poor conditions, overcrowding, and undernourishment, the camp was well ordered and run with military efficiency. RSM Lord's leadership and inspiration in this regard had undoubtedly saved many of the lives of those prisoners. What an incredible link to people and to the place that we were now stood. This connection to the past continued as we travelled across to Westerboing Heights. On high ground to the west of Oosterbeek was the Westerboing, a popular restaurant in the 40s that looked out across the Nederrhein. The hill that the restaurant was on offered a view of the surrounding area and was of a great strategic value. When the perimeter around Oosterbeek was established by the British, the Westerboing lay within that British territory and was defended by B Company of the 1st Border Regiment. On Thursday, 21st of September, a battalion of SS troops attacked the British soldiers near Westerboing. These SS troops did not have much experience, but were supported by 4 tanks. The British soldiers opened fire, causing many casualties amongst the Germans, and they managed to knock out one of those tanks. Through the battle, though, the British troops were forced to retreat further and further down the hillside, followed closely by those German tanks. Private George Everington, of No. 12 Platoon of B Company, was in charge of his platoon's anti-tank gun. He found himself at the rear of the retreating troops and managed to take out 2 of the 3 remaining tanks. Sadly, this was still not enough. The British troop carried out 2 more counterattacks to take back Westerboing, but they did not succeed. After a few hours of fighting, the Germans took control of the Westerboing. It cost them many soldiers and 3 tanks, but by holding this ground, they prevented the Driel ferry at the bottom of the Westerboing Heights from being used by the Allies to move troops and artillery across the river. In a final attempt to reinforce the perimeter and secure a crossing site, the 4th Dorsets, sent by Horrocks from 30 Corps, crossed the Rhine at night. Their main objective was to secure the Westerboing Heights so that future reinforcements could be brought in without being under constant German fire. Unfortunately, there were too few boats to make a crossing in any force, and because of the fast-flowing Rhine, the Dorsets landed widely dispersed. These troops were easily mopped up by the Germans, and only a very small number of Dorsets reached the British perimeter, the rest being killed or taken prisoner. Having threaded our way back from Arnhem, we now found ourselves driving under moonlight and entering the woodlands near the Westerboing, with the jeeps parked and concealed amongst the trees, full light and sound discipline being maintained. Charlie, Daff, Chemo and Co. brewed up for us all. Quiet discussion was had as we pored over a map, and eventually agreed that we were now most likely right on top of the SS positions, which overlooked the Rhine and the British in Oosterbeek 80 years before. It was an absolutely surreal, truly immersive experience, being sat there in the darkness, the rustle of leaves in the light breeze, the slow flashes of moonlight as the trees swayed, and the faint pinpricks of light in the distance in the low ground beyond us. It was impossible not to feel a connection to the past, To these men on both sides, and to even dare to begin to imagine how they must have felt. From Westerburn Heights we rallied once more and set out to follow the route taken by 156 and 10 battalions from their drop zones along the railway line past Wolfhazer, and once more past that famous culvert. This nighttime drive was a further incredible experience as we drove through the cool night air, the quiet woodlands, literally following in the tracks of these airborne troops, experiencing the same difficulty they would have had in navigating, in crossing the terrain, and in facing an almost unimaginable proximity to the German forces massed around them. This route, through the night, led us rather full circle and back to the start point of our visit, the commemoration and Hackett's Hollow. But our experiences were far from over.
This time it's easy for you, yeah?
So yeah,
Time number 6. It's easy for you.
oh yeah, no, this is number 6, isn't it?
6.
Yeah.
Oh, it's number 4, sorry.
As the battle had now progressed, two para and the other small elements of British forces had arrived at the bridge and become entrenched, locked in battle with the Germans, no progress being made. German presence in between Wolfhazer and Oosterbeek meant that the majority of British troops had been caught up, injured, taken prisoner, or trapped within what the Germans soon named the Hexenkessel, the witch's cauldron, the British perimeter around Oosterbeek. Pressure around this perimeter continued to mount, and on Monday, 25th of September, the Germans did everything they could to deliver a final blow to the paras there. As on the days before, the Germans bombarded the British positions with everything they had, including mortars and artillery. There were more than 100 artillery pieces located around the British positions in Oosterbeek, and the Germans fired mortars and grenades all day long. In fact, on the morning of the 25th of September, an officer at the Hartenstein Hotel in Oosterbeek recorded 135 mortars as well as grenade hits on the headquarters in only 45 minutes. Urquhart himself recorded, "One of our artillery batteries was overpowered, and for some time there were quite a few Germans in the area that we'd chosen as an escape route. The artillery soldiers managed to turn their guns and fire on the Germans less than 50 meters away from them." Through the use of artillery in this way, the British paras managed to drive out the Germans again, with substantial German losses. By early evening, the German attacks on the British positions were now over. The British had managed to hold their ground. As night fell and the fighting ceased, though, word came through to the British paras, and they were told of the decision to leave the perimeter that night, to withdraw all of the troops from Oosterbeek across the Rhine. It was a bitter moment, but with no food or ammunition left, their anti-tank guns empty of ammunition and disabled, men walking around like zombies after 9 days of shelling and mortaring, there was no alternative. With the situation in Oosterbeek completely untenable, the 1st Airborne Division were moved back across the Rhine in a planned operation codenamed Berlin. General Urquhart chose to leave a light screen of defence in the British positions during the night of the 25th in order to prevent the Germans from realising what the British were doing. Only when most of the British had withdrawn across the Rhine would the last of these defenders also withdraw. The British positions that night were manned mainly by Polish soldiers and soldiers from the 4th Dorsets, as well as military policemen who stayed behind to guard the 200 or so German prisoners of war held within the tennis courts at the Hotel Hartenstein in order to prevent them escaping and reporting on the British withdrawal. It was a cloudy, moonless, dark night. It was raining and there was a strong wind. The ideal conditions for retreating in secret. Soldiers wrapped their boots in cloths and socks to move as silently as possible, and they followed white ribbons that had been set out from their positions within the perimeter to the old church, the Oude Kerke, near the Rhine, moving in small groups so as not to be noticed. Heavy artillery from Nijmegen was fired onto the German positions to drown out the sound of the evacuation and to force German troops to take cover. The crossing started at 9:30 in the evening, and in small boats and even swimming, the Paras struck out to reach the other side of the river. It was only early in the morning that the German troops realised what was going on, and they began to fire at the boats. This caused the crossing to be halted at 5:45. Some 2,400 men had managed to reach the south bank of the Rhine. Many, though, had drowned during the attempt. The troops who provided the perimeter defence evacuated their positions just before dawn, but by the time these troops had arrived at the Rhine, it was already light and the evacuation had stopped. Some soldiers took the plunge and swam across the Rhine, but most soldiers stayed on the northern bank. These were later captured by the Germans that morning, and a number of those that tried to swim ended up succumbing to the powerful currents and cold water, and few of them managed to make it across. A Polish corporal wrote about the retreat. Many of the Paras within the Hexenkessel were not able to be evacuated, and the wounded, medical personnel, and hundreds of other troops were forced to remain, either hiding as best they could or becoming prisoners of war. Of the approximately 10,000 British and Polish soldiers who landed at Wolfhazer at the start of Operation Market Garden, only a fraction had retreated across the Rhine during the night of the 25th into 26th of September. That night, a total of 2,163 British and Polish soldiers reached the south side. This included 1,741 men from the British Airborne Division, and in addition, 160 Polish paratroopers, 75 men from the Dorset Regiment, and 422 glider pilots were also evacuated. Many of the survivors were amazed that they'd survived the battle. One of these was Lieutenant Hay. Emerging from the river, he ended up stood on a street in Driel, while the Germans fired grenades at Driel from the other side. A captain of the 43rd Division shouted to Hay, "Hey! Don't stand there! That's life-threatening!" Lieutenant Hay replied, "I couldn't help but laugh. It was the safest place I'd been in over a week." Back in real life, we were honoured to be asked to support an immersive experience for local primary school children, which saw the Airborne Battle Wheels organisation deliver a short presentation to them at the Oude Kerk in Oosterbeek. Only, unbeknownst to the children, when the words Operati Berlin were said, we, some 100 paratroopers, emerged from the darkness of the forest behind them and then led small groups, each along the white tape and down to the river, exactly as they did 80 years before. Recalling of the actual event, Lieutenant Bruce Davis wrote, We walked along a road and behind hedges and reached an open field which was held at gunpoint by a German machine gun. As we crawled along, there was suddenly a very bright light. But apparently, luckily, the Germans didn't see us. We ended up in a forest again. We stopped to rest, and as we crouched down, the man behind me fell forward onto his face. I thought he saw something and took cover, but when I reached him and rolled him over, he was dead. As we led the children, each time that we paused, because of a hold-up or lights or voices or movement in the darkness between the trees, each time we froze or we went to a knee, and the children with us followed suit. Once again, the tension, the experience, the connection to those events in September 1944 were searing. Returning now to the very start of the operation, it was paramount to the success of the whole Operation Market Garden that the British retained control of those landing areas. The multi-day landings had made it necessary for a large portion of the airborne troops to remain at these landing zones on Sunday the 17th of September in order to protect them against German attacks. Troops that otherwise might have moved forward and reinforced the advance to the bridge. Initially, these British had no problems. The German response was aimed at blocking access to Arnhem, and the landing areas were only of a concern to them later on. Indeed, the South Staffords reported having a quiet first night at Wolfhazer. By now, though, the two landing zones used by the British gliders were full, and that made it necessary to use a new landing area for gliders that would land on Monday the 18th. The 7th Battalion, King's Own Scottish Borderers, were therefore ordered to move west in the opposite direction of Arnhem to secure this new large landing area at Ginkle Heath. The next day then, as we know, saw the arrival of 156 Para Battalion and the 4th Airborne Brigade, and we know that Ginkle Heath was now being fought over by the King's Own Scottish Borderers and the Waffen SS, the Dutch troops, as part of the Wacht Battalion Enfield Dry. It was here to Ginkle Heath that we returned on Saturday, in order to attend the annual commemoration service and the parachute drop, an event that I last attended in 1994. The day was hot, even at 0500 hours. We drove onto the drop zone as the early sun burnt the dew off the grass. It was eerie, mesmerizing, and evocative, a really electrified moment, if that could be the right word. We sat and we watched as the day rose to 25 degrees. We felt every empathy with the troops 80 years before us, wearing the same kit, woolen shirts, heavy canvas smocks, heavy steel helmets. And we watched over 700 paratroopers from across NATO drop, including red poppy parachutes, to mark this 80th anniversary. And finally, a display by our very own Parachute Regiment display team, the Red Devils. It was a truly remarkable event. Sadly for us, this was pretty much the end. The rest of the Airborne Battle Wheels organisation carried on to take part in the famous Race to the Bridge, a convoy of Second World War vehicles that lasts more than 3 hours, running through from the drop zone to Arnhem itself. As we drove off the drop zone, thrilled, driving a Second World War Jeep off a Second World War drop zone, following again in the tracks of those incredible men before us, we suffered mechanical failure. The brake cylinders were binding on, the wheels locked solid as I drove. It's all my fault. I've got absolute mechanical sympathy, but no mechanical luck. And there, on the side of the road, just off the drop zone, is where our Arnhem adventure stopped. We had some truly fantastic moments. We met some wonderful people. We were truly humbled and privileged by the experience we had, and I am absolutely certain it won't be our last visit.